Good afternoon and welcome all to the launch of the book Adoption from Care. This event is organized by the Center for Research on Discretion and Paternalism at the Department of Administration and Organization Theory at the University of Bergen in collaboration with CMI, UIB, Law Transform and Bergen Global. My name is Lara Cortes. I am the coordinator at Law Transform, and I have the honor of chairing today's conversations with the book editors, its authors, two distinguished discussants, and our audience. With me, I have Marit, Skivenes, professor at the University of Bergen, and one of the editors, the three editors of the book. Adoption from Care is a result of two research projects where Marit Skivenes is a principal investigator. Marit, could you say something about the background for this book project?
Thank you, Lara. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today and to be a part of launching this book. The book discusses an immensely important topic within child protection because it's important for the families and for the children that have children that are placed in care, children that are removed by the child protection system, and especially discussing permanency and adoption for this group of children, I think is really valuable and important for me and for us. Adoption from care is a topic that is often neglected throughout Europe and throughout many countries. It is a part of the child protection system that is often not discussed in policy and nor in research. This book fills some of the knowledge gaps that we have in this area. And we examine policy and practice in high-income countries. So that means that there are many regions that are not covered by our book. But what we do detect is that policy and practice do indeed differ in these countries that we are studying, and we will return more about that later on. So why should we consider adoption from care? It is a general agreement and well documented that for some children, adoption is the best solution for them to accomplish permanency in a family and a long-lasting membership together with people that they love and that love them. What is secured by adoption is typically distinguished between three elements. First, it is that you have a legal permanence. That means that for a lifetime, you are connected by law to some others in a family. Secondly, you do have a residential permanency, which means you actually are physically going to live with someone that is your home. And thirdly, you have a relational permanency in which you are connected by love, by relations to someone that are significant others for you. And research do underscore that adopted children express higher levels of emotional security, sense of belonging, and general well-being. That is, of course, why this is important. Thanks to a great number of formidable authors, we are able to increase our understanding of how, when, and why children are adopted and not adopted. The book also discusses important topics in relation to attachment, the family concept, contact arrangement with birth families, and the European Court of Human Rights. In the following, we have prepared a tasting menu, small tasting menu, from the book, followed by discussions amongst some of the authors and some of the experts in this field. So thank you so far for your attention, and I will then give the word back to Lara.
Thank you, Marit, for this introduction. We'll now dig deeper into the highly interesting content of this book, and we have three contributors, Joan, Thoburn, Jill Berrick, and Tarja Pösö, that will present for us. First out is Joan Thoburn, an emerita professor at the East Anglia University in England. Joan is one of the three editors of the book and will give us an introduction on the field of adoption from care.
Hello, everybody, and great to be joining the team again. As social policy and social work educators, and researchers from very different countries, we three editors were aware that in high-income countries that share many family and child rights and child welfare principles, based as they are on the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, there were big differences in the extent to which differential use was made of adoption from care as part of the Child Protection Service. We linked up with colleagues from 7 other jurisdictions with a range of family welfare and child protection policies to explore the extent of these differences and why they might occur. The first...
And then 17% are also classed as special educational needs.
So, my apologies. The first step was to be clear about the data on children entering care and to understand trends in adoption. Could we have a slide there, please, Daniel? Oh, great. So this just, we just, here I've selected some of the countries just to explore the difference. Could it be the main, could it be a main, could you make it as the main presenter, so the picture so that I can read it? No, possibly not. In summary, anyway, the range was between very large numbers and a high rate of children adopted from care in the USA and England, and the opposite extreme, a very small rate from Finland, even though this didn't necessarily relate to the rate of children entering care. And in the middle, we had interesting countries like, so we were trying to find out why that was. And for instance, Estonia, the previous former communist country, had more children being adopted, for example, because they had more young children still within orphanages. So those are just, the table shows you why we were curious about that. So could we have the next slide, please? So in the introductory chapter, we start to hypothesize about explanations for these differences, which we would ask the chapter authors to explore. And these might include, and of course it varied hugely according to what sort of data was available, different histories and approaches to the role of the state in providing family welfare, different attitudes to family rights and responsibilities, and willingness to legally sever. This is a big issue. How willing is a country to legally sever the links between parents via child adoption? Different interpretations of the principle shared in every jurisdiction of the paramountcy of the child's needs for stability and family membership, and how this is weighed with continuation of birth family links. Differences in legal systems, interestingly, in some countries, adoption legislation was totally separate from child protection and family welfare legislation, in others, totally integrated. So the country authors will, and the people following me are going to say more about that, but it has been a very important learning journey, I think, for all of us. A pleasure to have worked with the scholars and practitioners who've contributed to the book. I'm sure that the readers will find much to take away from the pages. So a very big thank you to Marit, to Tarja, to the Bergen team for inviting me to join in this very exciting project. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, June. Next out is Jill Berrick, Professor of Social Welfare at the University of California, Berkeley. She has written the chapter focusing on the United States in the book, and the US is a very interesting case when discussing adoption, as adoption has a long history in the States and has been legally codified since the mid-19th century. So to tell us about adoption from care in the United States, here is Professor Jill Berrick.
Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you might be on the globe. I'm Jill Berrick, I'm sorry I'm not joining you today, but I understand that you're meeting while I'm sleeping. So I'm delighted to be with you via this recording. And a great big thank you and a big congratulations to those of you who created this wonderful new book, which just arrived in my mailbox today. So I'll look forward to reading that later this evening. So let me just take a couple of minutes to give you a quick overview of adoption policy and practice in the United States. In order to do so, I'm going to take you back in time to the very origins of the before times, before the United States was created. Going back to colonial times, we see evidence that adoption was practiced in the colonies, principally among men who adopted boys in order to secure their inheritance, in order to secure a line of property transfer, a line of funding transfer over time. But you see the first state law relating to adoption in 1851 in the state of Massachusetts. And it's an important law to take a look at because it's the first time that you use the first law, but it also attends to what we call the Adoption Triad. It's a law that attends to the rights of the birth parent, the rights of the adoptive parent, and the rights of the child. And so the fact that it attends to all three components of the triad is something that is an idea in our legal framework that we've carried through forward to today. If you move fast forward into the early 1900s, you see that in the early 1930s, the 1950s and before, a rising supply, and I hate to be mercantile about this, but if you think about this as a supply or demand equation, we had a relatively large number of very young children who were available for adoption, principally because there were a number of out-of-wedlock births and there was stigma associated with out-of-wedlock births. The infant mortality rate was falling rather rapidly, and we discovered baby formula, which allowed babies to survive separated from their parents. The problem was we really didn't have a demand for adoption during this period of time because many adults in the United States were concerned that if they brought in a child from a different home, a different family, a different bloodline, that their child would be tainted by that bad blood. So the eugenics movement, of course, which was very powerful in the United States, shaped the demand for adoption. Some of that shifted and began to shift through the 30s, through the 40s and 50s. Many people credit Georgia Tan with the Tennessee Children's Home as the individual who began to market adoption and make it more appropriate and more appealing for the demand side of the equation. Now, she did this through a variety of very nefarious, very deceitful, very inappropriate and illegal means, but nevertheless, it's clear that during this period of time, the supply-demand equation began to shift. What we also see during this time is that the schools of social work around the country rally to create some professionalism around the process and the practice of adoption. So social workers play a large role in claiming adoption as their field. And there's specialized training to help social workers learn how to do this work appropriately. This is where we see home studies developed, where we would examine carefully the home, the quality of the parents. And you see matching as the hallmark of good practice, matching around religion especially, but also around race. White children placed with white families, Black children placed with Black families when a Black adoption took place. You did not see racial matching occur for our tribal or our Native American children. In fact, there was an explicit policy during this time by the federal government to promote non-racial matching for our tribal children into white homes as a way to acculturate and then to eradicate their cultural connections. So we see the federal government get involved in adoption policy for the first time in 1978, but they only did it for our tribal children. It wasn't until 1980 that the federal government created an adoption policy for all other children in the United States. And if you look at these two policies side by side, they're somewhat different. So the 1978 law clarifies that a social worker's role is to make active efforts to keep that child with their birth family, if at all possible, to prevent a placement. Whereas for everybody else, the 1980 law says only reasonable efforts need to be made to prevent a placement. There's very clear that in the tribal law, the social worker must make a preference for a tribal placement to keep tribal children within their tribe, whereas that's not the case for the everybody else law, the 1980 law. And then the threshold over which one can make an adoption decision is quite different. So in order to reduce the likelihood of adoption for Indian children, to thwart that option, they set the adoption threshold at beyond a reasonable doubt for proving the unfitness of the parent. Whereas for the everyone else group, they only had to prove that a parent was unfit with a preponderance of the evidence. You see that in 1980 from this graph here, that we had a relatively stable rate of public adoption. And when I say public adoption, I mean adoptions from the foster care system. So we see a relatively low rate of adoption from the 1980s through the 1990s. Sorry about the external noise. When you get to the 1997, the federal government passes a new law, the Adoption and Safe Families Act, that's designed to incentivize adoption. There's a decision that they don't want children languishing in foster care, but they really want to create opportunities for children who cannot be reunified to be adopted. And so they created financial subsidies for adults who decided to pursue adoption. And they also created financial incentives for states if they increase their rate of adoption from 1 year to the next year. And so as you can see, after this law is passed, adoption rates from foster care really rise rather dramatically. In the United States, our foster care policy is written in such a way that we always are trying to pursue permanency from the early days of a child's placement. We want children to reunify with their birth parent if at all possible, but if that is not possible, then we're required to pursue adoption as our very second opportunity. And we see that of all children who exit the foster care system, about 45% reunify, about 25% are ultimately adopted. We do that in part because there is general public preference for adoption, because we do know from the research evidence that it's more stable than foster care. We also have good research evidence to suggest that the outcomes for adoption are much, much stronger than they are for other outcomes, such as remaining in foster care. And we also see today that adoption by relatives, by children's foster parent who happens to be a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle, is now one of the fastest growing groups. In spite of our enthusiasm for adoption, we also want to create some barriers so that we don't use it to excess. And so everybody has a lawyer, parents have a lawyer, birth parents have a lawyer, adoptive parents have a lawyer, children have a lawyer, social workers have a lawyer, and children have an opportunity to express their own views if they're old enough to do so. So we ensure that everyone's legal rights are protected first. We move towards a termination of parental rights second, and third, we might move towards an adoption only if we have secured everyone's rights first. There are subsidies available, as I mentioned a minute ago, to states. There are subsidies available to adoptive parents. Adoptive parents also get a tax credit. In many employment circumstances, they get parental leave, and they have access to public health and mental health services for their children, their adopted children, in some states up to age 26. When we look to the future of adoption, it is rapidly changing in the United States. All adoptions in the past used to be secret. And now, of course, they are not secret because usually the foster parent and the birth parent know one another. They have been working together towards reunification for 6 months, a year, 2 years before the adoption takes place. Similarly, it used to be a stranger who adopted a child. And now, of course, as I mentioned a minute ago, relatives are a very fast growing group that is engaged in the adoptive process. It used to be very closed. It's now open with ongoing contact between children and adoptive parents and birth parents. And we've shifted primarily from a 2-parent heterosexual model to many, many more single parents and LGBTQ parents taking adoption. I should note, though, that in 9 states in the United States, adoption by LGBTQ parents is not legal. So it is only legal in 41 states. The last issue that is unresolved in the United States about adoption relates to our tribal children. And there are a number of court cases making their way to the Supreme Court right now, which take our tribal children and raise questions about whether or not tribal rights, which is really the predominant rights structure that structures tribal children's adoption, should prevail, or whether parental rights or children's rights should have more credence in adoptive decisions. And so that's an issue that currently is playing out, and it's unclear where that will take us in the past. In general, there's great enthusiasm for adoption in the United States. We are often referred to as an adoption nation because the number of adopted children, number of adoptions is so very high. So I don't anticipate that that's going to change dramatically in the years ahead, though of course we will see continued changes and trends over time. So thank you all. Lovely chatting with you this afternoon, and I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful event.
Thank you, Jill. Our next presenter is Tarja Pösö, Professor of Social Work at Tampere University in Finland. She's the editor of the book together with Marit Skivenes and Joan Thoburn, and will tell us about some of the main learnings from the book. To make sense of adoption in very different contexts, Professor Tarja Pösö.
Thank you. You have given me a very difficult task to summarize the very rich book. And I think you have already got glimpses of the richness of the book. I try to say something, the very key messages which we have highlighted in the conclusion chapter. And the first one is, as you possibly have already heard, that the countries are very different. We had a look at 9 countries: England, Estonia, Ireland, the United States, Austria, Finland, Germany, Norway, and Spain, and realized that children in care are more likely to be adopted in the United States and in England and elsewhere. And those 2 countries have also well-developed guidelines and practice frames. Jill just used the word adoption nation, which is demonstrates that richness of guidelines and practice experiences well. In the other 7 countries, children are rarely, if at all, adopted from care. And these countries include countries with risk family services and children's rights orientations to child protection. And in some countries, even the notion of adoption care hardly exists, or it's not known. And this is the main conclusion, that interest in adoption within child welfare policy is not in general strong, despite the advantages which Marit mentioned in her introduction. And it's not only interest which is not strong, but also research. We found that there was surprisingly little country-specific research providing information about the different stakeholders in adoption from care, the characteristics, views, and coping mechanisms of children, birth parents, and adopters are only rarely studied outside the countries making more frequent use of adoption from care, that is England and the United States. And this means that child protection systems have to make policy and practice decisions based on very limited information they have. And this sort of the nature of interest and research, we of course hope that this book will inspire more research and debate on this complex but important topic, both internationally and nationally, because, as was said already before, children needing long-term care from the state should be given the best possible option to grow up, and the provision of options should be based on research-based knowledge of their strengths and weaknesses. And the research needs to be there has to be different types of research knowledge, because the rationales of child protection systems, welfare states, and the history and cultural meanings of adoptions vary among the countries. And the messages from research elsewhere have to be adapted to the specific country contexts and their understanding of private and public responsibilities, rights to family life, and children's rights. And we think that this book, with its contributions, highlight that very well. And we hope that it will be obvious to other readers as well. Thank you.
I want to thank the presenters we have had so far for sharing with us their knowledge and insights from the book, which I personally have found really interesting. I show you the book again here, since it's a book launch. And as Marit has mentioned, this was a small presentation of a very rich book and discussing relevant topics. And also, as Professor Tarja has mentioned, the importance of making decisions based on knowledge, the importance of research. So with us on video link, we welcome Jesús Palacios, professor of psychology at the University of Seville in Spain. He's one of the leading researchers on adoption internationally, and he'll share his reflections on the book from the perspective of the reader and as a scholar within this field of research.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I'm very honored to be part of this book launch. When I was invited to write an endorsement for the book, I was told to write something like perhaps 150 words endorsement, and I found that to be so difficult. It was much easier to write a whole foreword for another book with 6 or 7 pages, summarizing in just 2 or 3 lines the content of a book seemed to be almost an impossible task. So the very good thing is that it gave me a chance to know the book before the book was out, before the book was published. And I was very impressed with the quality of the book. The content of the book, I believe, is very interesting, very rich. And I'm glad that today I have a few more than 2 lines and a half to talk about the book and to participate in this book launch. So I would like to share with you a few reflections. Some of them have been already mentioned, and others are, I think, useful to provide a context for the book. Let me start with a description of my professional experience with the world of adoption. When I started my career as a very young researcher, I wanted to study attachment development, and the formation of attachment. And then at that time, some almost 40 years ago, I had the opportunity to study young children in an old orphanage in Spain before those orphanages were dismantled and converted into something very different. While I was spending my time in that old orphanage, I was curious when I saw in the administration offices of the building, I saw a drawer containing files under the label non-adoptable children. And I was so curious about that I asked permission to look at those files. And what those files contained were mainly files about children who were older, sibling groups, special needs children. So some 40 years ago, those special needs children, as we will call them today, were considered to be non-adoptable. A few years later, those are the only children who can be adopted, because in fact, the adoption of young babies, healthy young babies, or abandoned babies is still existent, but very limited. And most children who can be adopted are those who were considered at that time to be non-adoptable. So this is a dramatic change in landscape from considering some children to be non-adoptable to the fact that only or mainly special needs children are the ones who are being adopted nowadays. Another dramatic contrast I have witnessed in my professional career as an adoption researcher is in the domain of inter-country adoptions. And same as you, we have witnessed a dramatic change from the upsurge to the fall-off of inter-country adoptions. Here in my country, in Spain, from middle 90s, 1995, until the middle 2000s, 2004, the number of inter-country adoptions increased in 270%. A few years later, inter-country adoption is very minimal, it's very residual. So it's like a new curve with a very rapid increase and then a very rapid decrease as well, not only here in Spain, but in so many other, or in most other, or in all other countries as well. So it's another big contrast that we have witnessed. I remember myself when talking to child protection authorities, some perhaps 20 years ago, expressing my concern that perhaps children were placed for adoption too fast. That means without consideration or without due efforts for family preservation or for trying other possibilities before going into this final alternative of adoption. A few years later, just a few months ago, I was discussing with the policymakers here that perhaps children were placed too late for adoption, that adoption placement was taking longer and longer, and children were placed too late after too much exposure to instability, to maltreatment, to different forms of adversity. So again, a big contrast, a huge contrast that we have witnessed in our professional lifetime. In 2005, Marinus van Heijsendorp and Femi Juffer, our dear colleagues and friends from Leiden University, published a meta-analysis titled Adoption as a Successful Intervention. Some 15 years later, together with other colleagues, we have published different studies of adoption failures, of adoption breakdown. And although the number of adoptions that break down is relatively low, however, the number of adoptions that are of adoptive families that are struggling with important difficulties is not that long. And Susan Smith has estimated that to be between 25 and 30% of the adoptive families. So again, a huge contrast between one perspective and another. So adoption as a success, adoption as risk. And the last contrast I want to mention is the fact that the journal Child Abuse and Neglect has a call for papers for a special issue on the journal titled Adoption and Trauma. When I saw the call for articles, the call for manuscripts, my understanding was that they were requesting manuscripts about the impact of early trauma on the development of adopted children. But then, when looking at the content of the call for manuscripts, I realized that they were also including here the experience of adoption as traumatic. So the life experience of adoption for some people about as a traumatic experience. So these 5 little points referring to professional experiences in the world of adoption shows clearly that adoption is a world of contrast. It's a world of promises and difficulties. It's a world of enthusiasm, but also of lack of enthusiasm, of problems, of doubts, of questions. And some of these tensions are evident throughout the book we are presenting today. Some others are not, but I believe that they belong to the universe of concepts, ideas, problems on the understanding of adoption, on the adoption policies, and also on the practice of adoption. One of the things that I find very interesting when working on adoption, and this is, I believe, well reflected in the book, are the many perspectives in the analysis of adoption. And sorry, my timer is telling me that I should be ending this short presentation. I have taken wide advantage of the fact that not having just 150 words to say. So the many perspectives in the analysis of adoption include the legal perspectives, the ethical perspectives, the anthropological, sociological, and psychological perspectives. And although my own perspective is mainly the psychological one of the things I enjoy about working on adoption is the possibility to interact with colleagues using or from all these other perspectives. In 2010, together with David Brzezinski, we published a global view, a review of adoption research. A few months ago, we were requested if we were willing to update that, and we said, no, that task is impossible given the exponential increase in adoption research. So if that is the case, do we need another book? Do we need more research? And my answer is yes. And my answer is yes, because I think that these books add important things to the field. In its surface, the book could be taken as a description of how adoption works in 9 different jurisdictions. But in reality, it is much more than that. It is a rich analysis of the complexities of adoption, the legal, moral, social, and psychological, some of the legal, moral, social, and psychological issues involved.
Professor,
I'm just finishing saying that at a time of transformation in adoption policies and practices, the book enriches our understanding of adoption and points out some of the directions for the improvement and understanding and practice of adoption. Sorry for consuming more time.
Thank you so much for your comments. And I must say that this is a very hard position for a chair. When you just want to hear what the person wants to say, our discussant wants to say, I would love to just continue. And then the challenge of combining this with the next person here to present, but it was really, really important. Bringing these aspects from psychology and, as you say, everything connected. So thank you very much for your comments. We are now shifting perspectives towards the foster parents. In many countries, they are the ones caring for children placed out of home, who provide them with love, stability, and care children need. In Norway, it's only foster parents that can adopt children from care, but also in other countries, foster parents are adopting. On the stage, I welcome Lene Printzlau Våmartveit, chair of the Norwegian Foster Home Association. Lene's organization represents more than 3,000 foster families, and we are very glad that you could be here with us today to share your thoughts on this.
Thank you, Lara. And first of all, I would like to congratulate with the book to Marit and to the other authors. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for the invitation. We in Norwegian Foster Home Association think it's great that the authors of the book also want to bring out the user voices in the topic adoption in child welfare. Briefly about our organization, we are the only organization for foster homes in Norway, and we represent the entire voices of the foster home, both children and adults. Like you said, Lara, we are about 3,400 memberships, which amounts to approx 15,000 members. There's one membership each family. Our organization has recently conducted a user survey with over 1,000 respondents. The survey shows that there are many foster children who have a long period of residence in the foster home, and that as many of these children has their belonging in the foster family. Like you can see, long residence in the foster home, 17% over 10 years in the same foster home. In 80% of these cases, there were ordinary care takeovers, and in 79% are ordinary foster homes. About the motivation for being foster parents, one of the major motivations factors for being a foster home is the desire to expand the family. They want to include the child in the family. We in Norwegian Foster Home Association means that when it's in the child's best interest to be adopted, this is something the Child Welfare Service must work for. In Norway, the Child Welfare Act stipulates that all foster homes placements must be temporary. But from experience and from the survey, we know that many of these children from whom the Child Welfare Service has taken over care have a long period of residence in the foster home. And for some children, it's also an additional burden that takeover of a care is treated time and time again in the court system, even after many years in foster home. For some of these children, we think it is the best interest of the child to be adopted. Some of these children constantly need confirmation of belonging to the foster family, and the fear of being rejected becomes too great. Having a family on a contract, which can be terminated, becomes far too insecure for some children. From the foster parents' point of view, their entire parenthood can be erased with the stroke of a pen. The Child Welfare Service can terminate the contract, move the child, and then they have no relationship anymore. The foster parents have no legal rights. For foster parents who have had the children living with them for a long time and who sees the child as the child sees them as their psychological parents, adoption is the way to secure their relationship. If you adopt a foster child, you will in that way also protect your family as it looks today. But many foster parents have their own birth children, and they often have a close and good sibling relationship with the foster child. Many foster parents refuse to adopt their foster child because in Norway, there is no form for support from the state for foster child adoption. Neither financial support or guidance related to the child. Norway is not ready to use adoption as a child welfare measure as we see it. The child will have the same challenges as adopted as it had as a foster child. Nevertheless, adopted foreign parents, foster parents will be left without any support from the state. I am an adopted foster parent. I have adopted my child. For me and my husband, it was the child's best interest that we were absolutely decisive for us deciding to apply for adoption. We wanted the child to have a stable, safe, and predictable upbringing. And the only way that we could ensure that was by adopting the child. It can be stressful just being a foster child in itself. As previously mentioned, being a foster child is a temporary solution. The state has decided that work must always be done for a return. So we can say in a way that the child lives a waiting life, or they have their life on hold. Where should the child take root? Who should be allowed to be called mom and dad? How long should the child live a waiting life or have their life on hold before thinking that you should be? Here's your family, and here you're going to have your childhood, and here is where you're going to be loved. We in Norwegian Foster Home Association believe that in many cases of adoption, adoption is the best interest of the child living in foster home. However, due to the lack of follow-up and support from the state, adoption is not used as often as a child welfare measure. We believe that use of an open adoption with contact with biological parents should have been used more often. In that way, the child can be ensured a safer and a more stable childhood. Thank you.
Thank you, Lene, for your participation. We'll now have a short break and then come back to discuss the implications for the book for policy and practice. Welcome back to the launch of the book, Adoption from Care. We'll now have a panel discussion building on the book and the presentations we had earlier. Our main goal is to discuss the implications research and knowledge about adoption from care should have for policy and practice. In the panel, we have three of the presenters from earlier, Marit Skivenes, Lene, Printzlau, Våmartveit, who is, they two are here with me, and then Jesús Palacios, who is with us on Zoom. In addition, we welcome Professor Kenneth Burns from the University College Cork in Ireland. Kenneth is one of the authors of the chapter on Ireland in the book and has also wide experience on working with policymakers and professionals to improve child welfare. Before I start with our questions here, I would like to remind the audience that you're welcome to use the chat to ask questions as well. I would like to start with a question to Kenneth. In a publication from 2019 by Burns et al., titled The Hidden Procedures, an Analysis of Accountability of Child Protection Adoption Proceedings in 8 European Jurisdictions, it is clear, as the title states, that there is a scarcity of knowledge about when, how, and why adoptions are used and not used. Furthermore, the article points to some serious lack of accountability for these procedures, for example, lack of transparency. Why is it so, and are there differences across countries? Kenneth.
Thank you very much for the invitation today, and well done to everybody for their contributions to the book. The book and the article that you referred to examine what is a very sensitive and confidential decision-making process where families, birth families, foster families, or adopted families, and the state process and make sense of somebody's request to pursue an adoption. And in that way, there has to be a high threshold for there to be, for researchers, members of the media, or members of the public to have access to that process, because it is a sensitive process. What we learned from the book and from the article is that there's quite a diversity of decision makers in the countries examined. In some cases, it's in a single administrative body. In some cases, it's local courts that deal with other matters. In some cases, it's specialist courts, and in some cases, it's administrative bodies or quasi-judicial bodies that make those decisions. And in that sense, there's a huge variety of decision makers. And particularly when the decision makers involve courts, there's always a reluctance maybe on behalf of courts for there to be independent scrutiny of their practice. Now, there's a developing practice in many countries, including Ireland, of court observation to examine at the point of decision making how decisions are made. The other way to do that is to examine the publication of judgments associated with that decision. What the article in the book found is that there are a few countries who actually published anonymized judgments of adoption proceedings, so that decision makers, professionals, policymakers, families, and adoptive persons can learn about how decisions are made, not and the why of why decisions are made. So I suppose another point that one could consider in terms of why maybe there's a lack of transparency is, in some respects, some of the families involved in these decisions, there might be a lack of political power on their behalf in terms of advocating for access to that type of knowledge. And while Jesús talked earlier about the large amount of adoption research that's available at the moment, specifically, some of the countries found that that research attention doesn't necessarily fall upon the decision-making processes. And for some, maybe those countries will remain nameless, maybe Ireland is one of them, it can be hard sometimes to find out about the actual procedures involved. Although what was interesting is quite a number of the bodies were very open to discussing it once they were asked, including Ireland. And I suppose maybe the final thing to think about is we're talking about the hard edge of state power. We're talking about one of the most significant powers that a state can have. So we're talking about the legal severance of a child from their birth family, and whether it's appropriate or not. And Lene outlined many of the positive reasons. From the birth family's perspective, there's often a reticence and a difference of opinion as to whether this is the right way to proceed. So therefore, there is a need to protect their privacy and to for their circumstances to be protected. But the arguments in the book, and particularly the arguments in the article, is that there needs to be some form of transparency in the process. And that is in relation to researchers, that is in relation to the publication of judgments. And we'd encourage decision makers to do that more, because that would help all countries and all decision makers to think about how their countries make decisions.
Thank you. I see that one of the questions has already been answered in the chat. So just to encourage you to participate in the chat. Would you like, my idea is that we try to have for about 5 minutes for each question to secure that we have time for the audience at the end. So I don't know if any of you would like to follow up on this, or that we just go to the next.
Yeah, I could actually just to follow up on Kenneth's pointing out that these proceedings are quite hidden, and there are of course also huge differences between countries, which I think reflects some of the legal culture and also some of the legal kind of openness around various issues. We know that, for example, in Sweden, most of all types of court judgments are open and publicly available. We have some of the same tradition in Norway, but as Kenneth just said, in Ireland there is a very opposite thinking around these issues, and it's very closed and not as informative. And that is, of course, interesting. Also, I think it's important to think about the historical development in this area, and as also we have heard through the presentations from Jill and from Jesús, that these are kind of, it's of course colored by the culture that we are embedded in, and the historical happenings around these areas. And we also know that the state has misused their authority and their power when they have been for women in wedlock, for minorities that they think are different and that they want in some way of punishing. And of course, also we know that from South America and also from Spain, that there have been some really kind of some misuses from the state. But I was just wondering, perhaps because Jesús, he mentioned some of the trends that we experienced, but maybe you could have a little glimpse of how this is in Spain. Would that be fine?
Well, yes, that's fine. But just building on what Kenneth said, I would say that besides, and I find this to be quite important here in Spain, and I tend to imagine that it is also important in many other countries. Kenneth was referring to the need of more transparency in the proceedings, in the court proceedings. My point is that I believe that we also need more transparency in the decision-making process by the adoption professionals, by the foster care professionals, by the child welfare professionals. It may happen that in some cases where the child was with a foster care family, if that child becomes adoptable, if that child can be adopted, some professionals still think that foster care is one thing, adoption is another thing. There is another motivation, there is another set of family characteristics and all that. And that implies instability. That implies moving the child from one family to another. While the child had been placed for several years before, happily placed for several years before, as in the Norwegian case, with a family. Why do we need to change a family for that child? So I would expand the need of transparency, not only for the court proceedings, but also for the child welfare proceedings, with more respect for some of the basic principles of stability and permanence and children's well-being.
May I add to that to say just very quickly, in Ireland, the audience might be interested in a change that's happening, which is that we have overhauled our adoption laws in the last 10 years, and we have a single state child protection agency, and they're about to launch a permanence planning document. Up until about a year or two ago, it was very difficult to adopt a child from foster care. We have between maybe 13 and 25 per year, which is quite small. And the infrastructure is changing, so it's now becoming part of regular care plan reviews in the last year, that adoption from care has to be considered as an option. And there has been, just before the call, I'd spoken to an adoption manager, and she was saying that this is having very significant on-the-ground effect to enable foster parents who would like the foster child to be part of their family on a longer term, more secure basis, has enabled them to it's given them a pathway that they haven't had before. So just if anybody is interested, I'm happy to, if they want to email me to find out more about that. But in Ireland, you have an example where adoption from foster care really was an exceptional, very niche opportunity. And the interesting bit, which is what you said, is it's going to be about examining that culture of practice, and the historical culture, which in Ireland is a very nuanced and potentially many times unethical use of adoption, and how that might impact on current practitioners who might be nervous about this pathway. But yet it's one to watch. It's going to be an interesting development in the next few years.
Thank you. We'll continue this conversation. Jesús has touched upon this topic of permanency. And then my question to Lene, who is here with us, is from the foster parent perspective. Why is permanency important? Recently, a foster father wrote an op-ed at NRK Online, questioning and criticizing the principle of temporary placements. And I would like you to share your ideas on this with us.
Yes, thank you. Like I said earlier, children, they need to have a stable and a secure upbringing. This temporarily, it will make them insecure, and it will disrupt their development. I could share with you that when the little child came to us, she was just an infant. And we knew from that moment that we wanted to make her be safe, wanted to take care of her. And from the history of the birth parents, we knew that they couldn't take care of her for a very long time. And how do we secure this child's upbringing? How do we do anything for her like we would do for our birth children? So we have to adopt her. To secure our family, to secure her, we wanted the best for her in her life, like every mother and father wants for the children. So if we, in foster parents, the family task is difficult in itself to have a foster child. The task is to take care of a child that is vulnerable. And if this temporary thing is going to be an issue as well, it's going to be a very difficult task to be a foster parent. Maybe some children, when they get adopted, they will, like we said, they calm down, they will get secure that this is where I'm going to be. And some of the problems or the vulnerability might disappear. So not temporary, they have to be in the family.
Yes, so thank you, Lene. So the way you put it is not only for the foster parent perspective, but for the child's perspective as well. And then I would like to know what are the developments in terms of out-of-home placement in child protection? Maybe Marit and Jesús could help us here to understand how is the trend, if there is a new trend, policy changes in terms of adoption from care.
Thank you. Should I start, Jesús? Because I think
yes, please do start.
And then I will send it over to you afterwards. So I think that we have some trends that are developing, if you look at it historically, and Jesús already mentioned some of them. And Jill in her lecture also showed some of the trends in the US. And as pointed out, both the US and England has been very clear on their permanency policies. If we look at child protection and how children are placed, we have used, in some countries, there's a huge tradition for using residential units for institutions. And as I can see it now, is that this is declining, and we want to provide foster homes or more family-like situations for the children that have been removed from their birth parents. So this is one trend. When it comes to adoption, as we show in our book, it is in many societies, it's controversial and it's a difficult topic to discuss, sometimes because of the historical, sometimes because there are kind of political opposition and difficulties. But what we do see is that there are an increasing on the policy level. We do see that there are increasing emphasis on permanency, and also then including the legal permanency, as Lene pointed out for us here. And I think that we see it, for example, now in the new child protection legislation in Denmark. Kenneth mentioned that in Ireland, there are also new policy recommendations and new legislation. We see it in Japan and also in Norway, although we have had it for a while, we have seen that there is a shift in how the focus is. And I think one part of it is also explained by the increasing child right orientation. So we see that if you're thinking of being placed and growing up in public care, and if you take that position from a child perspective, that could also be something that will clearly influence how you think about placement alternatives. But maybe Jesús, we want to add on to my statements here.
Well, first, to reinforce some of what you already said, there are still many countries where group care, residential care, is the main child placement, out of home placement. And we don't need to travel far away. If I drive 1 hour from my home and I go to Portugal, 97% of children in care are in residential care. When traveling was possible, and I traveled a lot to Latin America, most of Latin American countries still have residential care as the main child protection alternative. So we need to stress more and more the need to move. And I think that Ireland is an excellent example of how a system basically based on residential care can be transformed into a system based in family placement, in family alternative. So that's one of the trends that we need to insist on for so many countries. Another trend is the need to move towards more open adoptions. And I think that there were several mentions to this in the preceding interventions. And I think that as the adoption landscape is changing, one of the clear directions of change is towards more and more openness. And an increasing number of countries are including now open adoption as an alternative. And I think that should be increased not only in the law, but also in the professional practices, in the way of doing things. And my final comment, and this follows the lines that Lene was mentioning before, is the need of more and better and more qualified post-adoption support. It makes no sense that families who are receiving some support while the child is in foster care stop receiving support when the child is adopted, when the needs of the child are the same, when the needs of the family are the same, when what the family has and what the family needs is basically similar. But it is not only about financial support. It is also about all the types of support. When the adoption landscape is becoming more and more complex, we cannot hope that the family will have the therapeutic resources. Most of the families are able to deal with the children's problems by themselves, but many of the families, and this happens more and more, will need some qualified clinical support to make their adoption stable, to make their adoption successful. So I think this is another trend for the future, the need of qualified and diversified adoption, post-adoption support.
This is a very relevant point. And I see that you have already touched upon part of the next question, but I can formulate and then you can also add. I know your experience shows that you have a lot to say to us, to share. So the dilemma in terms of parental rights and children's rights are obvious and much debated. But if a child is going to grow up in a public care, when is it and when is it not in the best interest of the child to be adopted? Perhaps Jesús would like to develop a little bit more on this.
Well, I would say that alternatives promoting permanence, stability, and well-being are the alternatives that need to be promoted for children. And that is true for children in general, and it is particularly true for children in care. I think those are the very basic principles.
Maybe I'd like also to hear about what are the decisive arguments in consideration for adoption. Is there when the child wishes to adopt, or when the birth parents give their consent, or child development experts recommend it? I assume there are variations considering the countries, the different countries, but I'd like to have your reflections on this. Marit, would you like to?
I can start a little bit. I think that this is an extremely difficult question, and we have seen that in the European Court of Human Rights when this has been debated, and typically for the European Court it will be the parents that bring their case up there, and often the child's rights and the child's point of view has been neglected. But I think that one point, and I think that what is coming now, as I also mentioned earlier on, is that when you take the perspective of the child, I think that will change the discussion and also the understanding of the child's best interest, which is the paramount consideration that we shall take in these decisions. Clearly, also the voice of the child will and shall be important. And if the child wishes an adoption or wishes and needs, of course, the permanence, That is, I think, very decisive and important arguments. And I think also, Lene, you mentioned some of these arguments already. So I don't know if you want to chime in here on this one or.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm very interested in when we talk about the right to family life, which family life? Is it from the birth parents, or is it the family life that you have in your foster family? Because the respect of the family life should also be the human rights of the child. And then who should decide which family life? The one you know that about, the one you're living in, or the birth parents' family life. Mm. So the perspective from the child is very important. From the perspective from the foster parents, like I mentioned about open adoption, to keep in contact with the biological parents. It is difficult because when you talk about human rights and the children's rights, who's the one that is the voice for the children that even can't speak or have an opinion about if they want to be adopted? Is that the birth parents, or is that the foster parents when they mentioned adoption? Who knows what is the best interest for the child? Who's is to decide?
Important point.
I was actually wondering, because this is Kenneth, he has a social worker perspective. I wonder if he had any thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, so I'd like to affirm everything that's been said so far. What we've noticed in Ireland is that there has been an increased conversation about discharging the parental consent. So if we're thinking about what's decisive, so if an adoption from care process is begun by the young person and it's their request, there has been, it's led by the social work department or it's led by the foster parents, it still comes back to parental consent, and processes and procedures here are very strong to ensure that the parent's voice is heard. But what you have in practice is that parents sometimes are in a gray space, either not wanting to be seen to consent to the process, but not wanting to frustrate it either. And it's kind of an in-between space in terms of confirming the process. And what you have here is you have quite a number of applications. The process here, we have the Adoption Authority of Ireland. They are quite a judicial administrative body who makes it a single body who makes a decision on all adoptions in Ireland. But for them to proceed and for them to make a decisive decision, they need to hear from the parents. But when the parents are unwilling in that grey space, either vociferously opposing, more than likely unwilling to either say yes or no, they have to apply to the High Court to discharge with a parent's consent. And that seems to be an increasingly significant part of the process, because in Ireland, parents' constitutional rights are very strong, and they would supersede kind of natural law. So therefore, the need to have a High Court order, which is a very significant order to dispense with parental consent, is significant. But what parents are saying is that it's, in many respects, it's bringing them back to the original reception into care again, and it's a kind of a tough, hard process for them to engage in. But at least there are clear decision-making pathways now. But I think we have to come back to the cultural change that has to happen in some countries, in Ireland in particular, about the remnants of ethical issues associated with adoptions, particularly forced adoptions to do with mother and baby homes, illegal adoptions, that we have to come back and we have to think about thinking about adoption as one option in a range of options for permanence planning. So when I think about adoption from care, I'm wondering in whose best interest is it? Why would states wish to pursue this as an option? If it's to reduce the numbers of care just for that purpose, then that's not a good reason. If it is to promote permanence and the foster parents and the child believe that that's in the best interest, including the social work department, then that's a good reason. So we need to think about what states are trying to do when they're creating these pathways. We have to think about, and in particular, I like Lena's argument earlier, which is that we need to think about, if we're thinking about if something is in the best interest or not of a child, we need to think about it across their full lifespan. So it's no longer just this child has been in care for 3 years. We now need to consider adoption from care, and then the state walks away from it. We need to move to a different type of model where the state continues to provide the psychological care, the financial payments, and other type of advice and supports that foster parents would normally get, and continue that beyond the adoption to care. And interestingly, Ireland's not often seen as a paragon of good decision making in this regard, but in the last few months, the situation has changed there, that if you are a foster parent and you adopt a child from care, the payment now continues beyond up until the age of 18. And also some of the practical supports continue, but maybe not so in terms of aftercare. So I would like us to think about a more joined up long-term kind of planning. And if we're making a decision about what's in the best interest of a child now, we need to think about it across all of the years from 0 to 18, plus their transition into young adulthood, and then on into their later experiences with families.
Thank you, Kenneth, for your points. So we have our audience here. Due to Corona restrictions, we could not have many people, but those who are here are very enthusiastic about the event and also want to ask questions. Regarding the chat, I see that Joan is being active in answering as far as I could follow, so thank you. Please say your name and to who you'd like to.
Yes, thank you. It's okay, yeah. My name is Hege Helland. I'm a PhD candidate at UIB. And I just want to say thank you to everyone for this really interesting presentations. And I'm very interested in this. One of the things that we learned from the book is that they're so different in how we use adoption, and that many countries have legal, or it is a legal opportunity to do it. And also often the legal threshold isn't that high. But then adoption isn't used. So it can be policy, it can be a lot of things, but I was interested in the Norwegian point of view. So I have a question for you, Lene, because one of the things that we don't have that much information about is from the foster parents' point of view. So in Norway, we know that like almost all decisions that enter the court system or the first line instance, they end with an adoption. So in your opinion, or do you have any reflections upon, is it because foster parents don't want to adopt, or is it because the child welfare agencies don't initiate it or want to take it to court?
I think it's both. Like I mentioned earlier, I think that foster parents won't adopt because, like we said, there are no support system. If you adopt, the umbrella will be cut and good luck. There's no financial support, or neither something related into the child when you need support and guidance about the child. Also, I think in the child welfare system, to use forced adoption, and that's a really difficult thing to use. So I know that my child welfare system, that they were the first one to mention how about adoption, because we know in this case that this child is going to be in a foster care for a really long time. How about thinking about adoption? Still, it went several years because of the court system. We went every court system we could to get the adoption. So I think it's both. It's really to use forced adoption is not something I think the child welfare system like to do. And the foster parents, they need the support. They really need the support. Like I said, the challenges for the child is the same if they are adopted or in foster care.
Thank you, Lene. So we have 4 minutes before we end our session. Time will just run fast when we have interesting people talking about relevant topics. And I'd like to thank all the participants for this important discussion. I would like to give Marit the chance to have like a 1 minute last closing for the session. Please, Marit.
Thank you, Lara. And I would just continue what you started here. So thank you so much, everyone, for participating. Clearly, this is a very difficult topic, and we have been touching upon many of the difficult issues, especially around the rights of the parents and the rights of the children, but also the state authority that we do see in this area. And I think that what you said, Lene, when it comes to why don't we use it more, and answering Hege's question, is that it is a use of force when the parent does not consent to an adoption. And we, of course, we do see that in adoption cases, parents do consent also, but there's something when the state is actually having an intrusive intervention that is involuntary, that is extremely strong, and it's difficult to do, because what you're doing then is that you need to do it right, and then the state is taking upon the responsibility to making the right decision, and that is a very difficult decision to actually stand behind. So I think that's an important explanation. At the same time, we do see that in many countries, at least the Anglo-American countries, adoption is used a lot. And we also see it actually in the Eastern European countries that adoption is used a lot. What I wanted just to have the closing, and I know that you said 1 minute, Lara, so I will keep it close to 1 minute, is that we have had a great set of authors contributing. We have had a great publisher that also been very, very efficient and wonderful to work with. And also, I think that some of the topics that we haven't touched upon today, as I mentioned in the introduction, around attachment, around the family concept has also been kind of briefly up here. Also around the contact arrangement, we do see that some of the trends are that we have more open adoption. We are going from from stranger adoption to known adoptions, which is of course very important for the child. But I think that some of these trends that we are seeing now is immensely important to look more into, and contact is then one of them. And of course, what we see from a Norwegian perspective, since we have so many of our child protection cases up in the European Court of Human Rights, the chapter on the court is also, of course, very interesting. So I think that by that, I want to thank everyone for being a part of this, and especially also to you, Lara, for having been hosting us and moderating us and keeping us within the frame. So thank you for that.
I'd like to thank all participants again for this important discussion, and to thank you for following this event. I hope you find the book Adoption from Care interesting and relevant as much as we do. And thank you.